So this segment examines how the capacity to engage in violence shapes political interactions and the formation of political orders like states. I want you to understand first that politics is an innately social process. It's about coordinating or directing the behavior of lots of people. Thus, it's a way to understand how people interact with each other to produce broad social outcomes like war or an election result. Political scientists tend to focus on one means by which social behavior is coordinated, and that is through the presence or absence of authority relationships. Economists tend to focus on how social behavior is generated through markets. Psychologists look to individual cognitive or emotional sources of social behavior. Sociologists look at norms, culture, or collective identity. So let's talk about what is politics. A standard definition of politics is the following. Politics refers to the use of authority to allocate scarce resources and settle conflicts that exist within a group or a community. There are two important components to this definition. The first is the presence of authority. Authority is the capacity to direct the social behavior or the actions of others. Someone or something, say a political organization that possesses authority, can tell you to do something that you might not otherwise do, and then impose a penalty or cost on you if you fail to follow that directive. In this way, authority often rests on coercion. However, authority is distinct from pure coercion in that it's also legitimate. Legitimacy means that the target of the directive recognizes the right of the person in authority to make those decisions, even if they disagree with the specifics of a decision. Thus, politics is about the use of authority to coordinate social behavior. So let me give you an example of this. The federal government orders us to pay a proportion of our income every year in income taxes. There are probably a lot of us that don't like to make these payments. We pay our taxes anyway for a number of reasons. The government threatens us with physical coercion, that is throwing us in jail, if we violate that directive. Moreover, a lot of people comply with that directive because they believe that the act of collecting revenues by the federal government to pay for military protection or things like roads is a legitimate act of government. Now, people can think of this collection as legitimate even if they disagree with the amount being collected. Thus, you can have lots of Republicans, for example, that think federal taxes are too high, and then they engage in political activities designed to reduce or eliminate those taxes. Despite this political disagreement, most of those same Republicans still follow the directive to pay taxes because they think the federal government's right to collect those revenues is legitimate. So if politics is about authority, it's also about using that authority to settle conflicts among individuals or groups within society. So this is going to bring us to the second component of our definition of politics, the allocation of scarce resources. Conditions of scarcity implies that everyone's demands for something or resource cannot be satisfied. So this unmet demand activates conflict among individuals, among groups, over how these scarce resources will be allocated, which groups get their needs met and which groups don't. Politics is about using authority to settle these distributional conflicts within society. For example, when Barack Obama won the presidency in 2008, he had campaigned on higher taxes for the wealthy as a means to help get the budget deficit back under control. Republicans disagreed with this policy, preferring instead to cut taxes and government spending. The Congress and the president eventually reached a legislative compromise that raised taxes on people making more than $400,000 a year. Thus, a conflict within the United States between Democrats and Republicans over how to allocate the fiscal responsibility for the budget deficit taken on in the aftermath of the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the financial crisis of 2008 was settled through constitutional rules that allocated authority over fiscal policy to both branches of government. This sharing of authority forced a compromise that temporarily resolved the deeper political conflict among Republicans and Democrats over fiscal policy. In this compromise, the President and the Congress together use their authority to direct wealthy individuals to assume more responsibility for this deficit burden.
Okay, so next we want to exploit this definition of politics to examine why the capacity to engage in violence is so central to political order. Now, first, let me define political order. I think of this as this idea of a political order as stable patterns or regularities of social behavior induced by authority relationships or coercion. Now, remember the relationship between authority and coercion. Coercion, or the ability to impose costs, is generally necessary to the provision of authority, but coercion on its own does not equate with authority. The presence of authority implies that its holder also possesses legitimacy. Not all individuals or groups that can coerce are also legitimate. Think here about the schoolyard bully. He or she takes lunch money under the threat of beating his target up. But this target doesn't view these actions as legitimate or recognize the right of the bully to extort money. So let's talk about why the capacity to coerce might be necessary to the provision of authority. And I want to do this with a thought exercise. Now, I imagine a few of you have been down on 6th Street when the bars close early in the morning. I, of course, never go down there. Pat's there every weekend. Now, you have probably noticed a few things. A lot of inebriated people, many of them doing questionable things like getting in a car to drive or perhaps starting a fight with someone on the street. You also probably saw a lot of police officers down there. Now, what is the police officer's role in that political order? It is to enforce the law, to ensure that violators are punished so that people can feel safe being out at that time without providing for their own security, either by carrying a gun or hiring private security services. Note, though, how they enforce the law. Their directives are backed by the capacity to physically coerce people for noncompliance with the law, to physically detain individuals and haul them to jail. Note also that most people down on 6th Street view this as a legitimate use of coercive force.
Now, imagine what would happen if the police just walked off the job at 1:30 in the morning. Would everyone just go home? Many would, but some people, perhaps those stronger than others or already armed, or maybe just the drunk ones that possess temporary liquid courage, might start creating problems, hassling people, threatening to take their money. How would people in general respond? Many would just stop going down to 6th Street on weekend nights. Now, this would obviously hurt economic activity in downtown Austin. Others, though, would start to arm themselves, in part because they expect others to do the same. Suddenly, the social dynamics would change very rapidly if people expect to need to protect themselves with weapons. The only people that would show up on 6th Street would be the ones that are armed. And let me ask you this. Do you think there would be more or less violence on 6th Street if everyone down there drinking at night had a gun? In short, one of the takeaway points here is that the capacity to use physical force is sometimes necessary to enforce laws that are designed to coordinate social behavior so that people can interact peacefully. This is one of the claims of Hobbes in Leviathan. You centralize power and give its holders the capacity to deploy it so that people don't harm each other and their property, to ensure more generally that society can function. The delegation of coercive capacity, though, opens up a big dilemma that we will discuss in the next segment.
Okay, now we want to build on this discussion about coercion, legitimacy, and political orders to help us think about states in the international system. Our discussion about the police officer on 6th Street should help us see one of the defining attributes of states. States and their representatives possess the capacity to coerce people, to settle disputes with the threat of violence, and to impose peace on people living within their boundaries. That's what states do. The capacity to settle disputes with violence, if necessary, is central to the construction of a domestic political order that we generally associate with the state. States include a government that rules over some group of people, a bureaucracy tasked with implementing the directives of a government, defined territorial boundaries within which states can rule, and a monopoly on the organized capacity for violence within a domestic political order. The state can use this control over the legitimate use of violence to disarm military rivals or rebels, to settle political conflicts within the state, and to impose peace to preserve the domestic political order. States break down when they lose the capacity to preserve this monopoly on organized violence. When sub-state groups from rival militias that attack civilians or government troops to challenge the government's rule. We can see these dynamics in the formation of many rival armies in Syria throughout its civil war. This means that domestic political orders rest on the state's capacity to prevent the emergence of military rivals.
Now, domestic orders managed by the state are unique in that they generally possess some legitimacy. People within a state don't need to be coerced to follow all government directives because they view them as legitimate or appropriate. Obviously, there's some significant variation here. Some societies view their governments as more legitimate than others. Finally, we also want to point out how central this capacity for engaging in organized violence is for the construction of political orders between states. Frequently, the preservation of a state depends on preventing an outside state or government from interfering in its domestic political affairs. And this exclusion frequently depends on possessing the military capacity to punish external actors if they interfere. In other words, relations between states frequently depend on military power and the threat of war. States remain states through their ability to wage war and prevent outside actors from conquering them. Accordingly, the capacity for violence and war plays a central role in generating a larger political order among states and determining which states get to set the broader rules that govern the international system.